The U.S. Navy operates 11 aircraft carriers. Not 10, not 12. Exactly 11. And before you think that's just some random number that happened to work out, let me stop you right there. The Navy doesn't do random. That number is the result of decades of war games, budget battles, and some very expensive math. A math problem that, by the way, costs American taxpayers about $26 billion a year to solve. So buckle up, because we're about to find out why the most powerful Navy in history landed on 11 as its magic number. Here's the thing about aircraft carriers. They're not just big boats with planes on them. They're floating cities, 75 aircraft, 5,000 crew members, enough firepower to flatten a small country before lunch, and the ability to project American power anywhere on the planet within a week. But here's what most people don't realize. When you see one carrier cruising through the Pacific looking intimidating, there are actually two more you don't see. One's in maintenance getting fixed up. Another's training its crew or heading home. That's the hidden reality of carrier math. The Navy calls it the rule of threes. For every carrier on deployment doing the actual job, you need two more in the pipeline. One recovering, one preparing. It's like having 3 shifts at a factory, except each shift costs $4.5 billion and takes 5 years to build. Do the math on that and you get 9 carriers minimum just to keep 3 on station at any given time. But the Navy has 11. Why the extra 2? Let's rewind to 2001. September 11th changes everything. The USS Enterprise and USS Carl Vinson are already in the region when the towers fall. Within weeks, they're launching strikes into Afghanistan. But here's the problem. Both carriers need to rotate out eventually. Crews get exhausted. Equipment breaks down. You can't run a carrier deployment forever, no matter how much coffee the Navy stocks. So more carriers steam toward the Middle East. The Kitty Hawk, the Theodore Roosevelt, the John C. Stennis. At one point, the Navy has 5 carriers in or near the Persian Gulf. 5 out of 12 at the time. That's when the math started getting uncomfortable. See, the Navy's been operating on a 10 to 12 carrier fleet since the Cold War ended. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, defense budgets got slashed. The Navy had 15 carriers. By 2007, that number dropped to 11. And here's where it gets interesting. Congress actually mandated in 2006 that the Navy must maintain at least 11 carriers. Not 10, not 9, 11 minimum. They wrote it into law. Why? Because the Pentagon ran the numbers and came back with a terrifying answer. The United States has global commitments that don't care about budget cuts. Japan needs the security umbrella. South Korea can't defend itself alone against the North. Taiwan lives under constant threat from China. The Persian Gulf needs a carrier presence or oil prices go insane. And that's just Asia and the Middle East. What about Europe? What about the Mediterranean? What about Africa? What about responding to natural disasters? Evacuating Americans from war zones? Or showing up when a rival power starts making moves? The Pentagon calculated that to meet America's actual obligations around the world, you need 3 carriers deployed at all times. 1 in the Pacific watching China, 1 near the Middle East watching Iran and securing oil lanes, and 1 floating wildcard for wherever crisis erupts next. 3 on station. That's the minimum. Run the rule of threes and you get 9 carriers just for routine peacetime operations. But what happens when routine goes out the window? What happens when 2 crises pop up simultaneously? What if China moves on Taiwan while Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz? What if Russia decides to test NATO while North Korea goes nuclear? Suddenly 3 carriers doesn't cut it. You need 5, maybe 6, all at once. That's where carriers 10 and 11 come in. They're your surge capacity, your insurance policy, your ace in the hole. Let's talk about how this actually works. Because the carrier deployment cycle is fascinating in a deeply nerdy way. A carrier spends roughly 7 months deployed, combat ready, launching aircraft, projecting power. The crew gets leave, families reunite. This phase lasts about a month. Then comes the fun part. Maintenance. The carrier pulls into a shipyard and an army of contractors swarms aboard. They replace parts, fix systems, upgrade electronics, repaint everything. This takes about 6 months for regular maintenance. But every several years, a carrier goes through something called a refueling complex overhaul, or RCOH. which is Navy speak for ripping the entire ship apart and rebuilding it. That takes 4 years. 4 years where a billion-dollar warship sits in dock being effectively useless. After maintenance comes training. The crew drills. The air wing practices landings. Everyone remembers how to not crash into each other. This takes another 6 months. Then the whole cycle starts over. 7 months deployed. 1 month off. 6 months maintenance. 6 months training. That's 20 months. Do this twice and you're at 40 months. Or about 3.5 years. That's one complete carrier cycle. Now here's the kicker. With 11 carriers, the Navy can theoretically surge to having 6 or 7 deployed simultaneously in a crisis. Not for long. Maybe 90 days before the system breaks down. But for 90 days, America can put enough carrier power in the ocean to make any adversary reconsider their life choices. That's the theory anyway. Let's test this theory with some real numbers. Right now, in early January 2026, where are America's 11 carriers? The USS Gerald R. Ford is in the Atlantic doing training exercises. Bunge is in the Mediterranean, probably keeping an eye on whatever's happening in the Middle East this week. The USS Harry S. Truman just came back from deployment and is in maintenance. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower is getting ready for its next deployment cycle. The USS Carl Vinson is in the Pacific. The USS Abraham Lincoln is in San Diego in port. The USS George Washington is forward deployed in Japan, which is permanent Pacific presence. The USS Theodore Roosevelt is in maintenance. The USS Ronald Reagan just came back from Japan to the States for overhaul. The USS John C. Stennis is in the yards getting refueled. And the USS Enterprise, the newest one, is still being built and won't join the fleet until 2028 at the earliest. Wait, you counted 12 carriers, didn't you? Here's the twist. The Enterprise isn't operational yet. So right now the Navy actually has 10 Ford-class and Nimitz-class carriers in service. The 11th is still under construction. Once Enterprise joins up, the oldest Nimitz-class carrier, probably the Nimitz itself, will retire. The cycle continues. But let's get back to the question. Why not 10 carriers? Why not save the money? A carrier costs about $1.2 billion per year to operate. That's fuel, crew salaries, maintenance, aircraft, food, everything. Cut one carrier and save $1.2 billion annually. Sounds great, right? Except it's not that simple. Drop to 10 carriers and suddenly your surge capacity evaporates. You can still keep 3 deployed on rotation, barely. But the moment a crisis hits, you're scrambling. You're extending deployments, which kills crew morale and retention. You're deferring maintenance, which is how ships break. And you're praying nothing else goes wrong because you're out of options. 10 carriers means operating on a razor's edge with zero margin for error. The Navy learned this lesson the hard way in the 2010s. Budget cuts meant carriers sat pierside because there wasn't money for fuel or flight operations. The USS Harry S. Truman almost got retired early to save money. Deployment lengths stretched from 6 months to 7, then 8, then 9. Sailors started leaving the Navy because they never saw their families. Aircraft readiness dropped because there wasn't time or money for proper maintenance. The whole system started groaning. Then 2018 happened. The Pentagon published the National Defense Strategy that basically said China and Russia are back to being serious threats, and the era of easy military dominance is over. Suddenly, 11 carriers didn't seem like enough. Some strategists started arguing for 12, or even 15. Bring back the Cold War fleet, they said. China's building carriers. Russia's getting aggressive. We need more hulls in the water. But here's the problem with 12 carriers. The math doesn't actually work out better. Remember the rule of threes? 12 carriers gives you 4 on deployment, 4 in training or maintenance, and 4 recovering. Sounds good. But it only works if everything goes perfectly. If one carrier's refueling overhaul runs long, which they always do, suddenly you're back to 11 functional carriers anyway, and you're paying for that 12th carrier's crew, its air wing, its escorts, its support ships, all while it sits in a dock in Newport News for 4 years getting its reactor cores swapped out. The real bottleneck isn't the carriers themselves. It's everything else. Each carrier requires an air wing of 75 aircraft. Growlers for electronic warfare, E-2D Hawkeyes for early warning, and a handful of helicopters. The Navy only has so many aircraft and pilots. You can't just buy more carriers and expect the planes and crews to materialize. Then there's the Carrier Strike Group. A carrier never deploys alone. It brings friends. At least one Ticonderoga-class cruiser for air defense, 2 or 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers for missile defense and strike capability, a fast attack submarine lurking somewhere nearby, supply ships to carry fuel, food, and ammunition. All these vessels need crews, all need maintenance cycles, all cost money. A full carrier strike group runs about $8 billion just to deploy for 7 months. Not to build, to deploy.
SAS.
Navy operates more carriers than the rest of the world combined. China has 3. The UK has 2. India has 2. Russia has 1 barely functional carrier that breaks down constantly and needs a tugboat escort. France has 1. Italy has 2 smaller ones. Japan has 2 helicopter carriers. They're converting for F-35 sets. Add it all up and you get maybe 15 carriers worldwide that aren't American. The US has 11. But numbers don't tell the whole story. An American supercarrier isn't comparable to anyone else's carrier. Take China's carriers. The Liaoning is a refurbished Soviet hull from the 1980s that China bought from Ukraine and spent a decade figuring out how to operate. The Shandong is China's first domestically built carrier, but it's still a smaller design using ski jump launches instead of catapults. The Fujian, their newest, has electromagnetic catapults like American Ford-class carriers, but it's still smaller and carries fewer aircraft. China has 0 combat experience operating carriers. America's been doing this since World War II. Experience matters more than you'd think. Operating a carrier is absurdly complex. You've got aircraft launching and recovering every few minutes, jet fuel flowing through pipes, ordnance being moved from magazines to flight deck. One mistake and people die. Aircraft go over the side. Fires break out. The Navy's been perfecting this dance for 80 years. China started learning in 2012. So 11 carriers gives America something no other nation has. The ability to show up anywhere on the planet within 7 days with enough military power to win a regional war. And the ability to keep doing it indefinitely, because while one carrier's on station, another's getting ready to relieve it. That's power projection at a scale that makes China's growing military look like a regional force trying to go global. Because that's exactly what it is. Let's talk about what happens when carriers actually show up somewhere. In 1996, China fired missiles near Taiwan during their presidential elections. A show of force meant to intimidate. The US responded by sending 2 carrier strike groups to the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese immediately backed down. No shots fired, no war. Just the presence of American carriers was enough to end the crisis. That's the value proposition. In 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami devastated Japan. Within days, the USS Ronald Reagan was off the coast launching helicopters to deliver supplies and rescue stranded people. The carrier became a floating airport, refueling station, and command center for humanitarian operations. That's the other value proposition. Carriers aren't just for war. But maintaining 11 carriers means accepting some brutal realities. Each carrier has a 50-year lifespan if properly maintained. After about 25 years, they need that 4-year refueling overhaul. That means at any given time, at least one carrier is in RCOH. Right now it's the John C. Stennis. When it finishes, another one will go in. The cycle never stops. The Navy's essentially running a perpetual construction and maintenance operation just to keep 11 carriers operational. And it's about to get more expensive. The Navy's replacing its old Nimitz-class carriers with new Ford-class carriers. The Ford-class has electromagnetic catapults instead of steam catapults. More electrical power generation. Better radar systems. Improved aircraft elevators. The first Ford-class carrier, the U.S. Gerald R. Ford, cost $13 billion to build. $13 billion. That's roughly 3 times what a Nimitz-class cost back in the day, even adjusting for inflation. Congress was not happy about that price tag. There were investigations, hearings, angry letters. But the Navy stuck with it because once you start building a class of ships, you're committed. The second Ford-class carrier, the USS John F. Kennedy, cost $11 billion, still absurdly expensive. But at least the price is dropping. By the time the Navy finishes building all the planned Ford-class carriers, they'll have spent over $100 billion. That's more than the entire GDP of Ukraine. So why not just build smaller, cheaper carriers? Some countries do this. The UK's Queen Elizabeth-class carriers cost about $4 billion each. France's Charles de Gaulle cost about $3 billion. Why not follow their lead and build, say, 20 smaller carriers instead of 11 supercarriers? Because smaller carriers are less effective. They carry fewer aircraft. They have shorter range. They need more support ships. They're more vulnerable to attack. And paradoxically, they don't actually save that much money because you still need the crew, the air wing, the escorts. You've just spread everything across more hulls, which creates more logistical headaches. The Navy ran this analysis multiple times and keep coming back to the same answer. Big carriers are more cost-effective than small carriers if you need global reach. Plus, there's the intimidation factor. When a Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier pulls into port somewhere, it makes a statement. It's 100,000 tons of American power sitting in your harbor saying we're here and we can stay as long as we want. Smaller carriers just don't have that same presence. But 11 carriers creates a strategic vulnerability that keeps Pentagon planners up at night. What happens if America loses one? Not from old age or budget cuts, but from enemy action. A carrier hasn't been sunk since World War II, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. China's developing hypersonic anti-ship missiles specifically designed to kill carriers. Russia has similar weapons. Iran has swarms of fast attack boats and submarines. A lucky hit with the right weapon could mission kill or sink a carrier. Suddenly, 11 becomes 10. And 10 carriers, as we've established, doesn't really work. This is why the Navy is paranoid about carrier defense. Each carrier strike group is basically a mobile missile defense bubble. The Aegis cruisers and destroyers can track and engage hundreds of targets simultaneously. The submarine hunts enemy subs. The carrier's own aircraft provide combat air patrol. E-2D Hawkeyes watch for incoming threats from 300 miles away. The whole system is designed on the assumption that someone, somewhere, is actively trying to sink these ships. And here's the thing. They probably are. Every time a carrier deploys, you can bet Chinese surveillance satellites are tracking it. Russian intelligence is updating files. Iranian speedboats are taking notes. Because sinking an American carrier would be a strategic game-changer. It would shatter the myth of American naval invincibility. It would create a gap in coverage somewhere. And it would force America to question whether carriers are still viable in an age of advanced missiles. The Navy's answer to this is layers of defense, constant vigilance, and accepting that carriers are valuable enough to risk. Because the alternative is not having carriers at all, which means giving up on global power projection, which means ceding influence to China and Russia. And that's not happening. So we come back to the number 11, not 10, because that's too few for surge capacity and creates operational fragility. Not 12, because the math doesn't actually improve enough to justify the cost, and the U.S. doesn't have enough support ships, aircraft, or crews to fully utilize a 12th carrier anyway. 11 is the sweet spot, the minimum number needed to meet global commitments with just enough margin for emergencies. It's a number derived from threat assessments, budget realities, maintenance schedules, and decades of operational experience. It's not sexy, it's not round, but it's what works. And in the world of military strategy, what works beats what looks good every single time. If you learned something new, hit that subscribe button. More deep dives on military strategy coming soon.